Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. Welcome. My name is Lisa Valdez. I'm a professor of government and Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies. And you know I mean it when I say I am really glad to see you all here today. We are a nation that talks about sex all the time. And in all the hashtags and Instagram photos and texting back and forth, it turns out there's actually a lot of things that we don't say about the way we have sex. Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan started with this insight when they started to think about sexual assault on campus. And using their prodigious skills as social scientists, they began to orchestrate a massive study of sexual assault on college campuses. We are here today to talk about the book that came out of that study, Sexual Citizens, Sex, Power, and Assault on Campus, that came out in 2020. I am here to introduce our speakers, talk a little bit about the format for today, and kind of oversee the ongoings. Jennifer Hirsch, now I have to preface this by saying these are the shortest introductions for two of the longest CVs that exist in the social sciences in the United States. It's very generous of our colleagues. Jennifer Hirsch is a professor of Socio-Medical Sciences at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. Shamus Khan is a professor of Sociology and American Studies at Princeton University. Together, they are the authors of Sexual Citizens, published by W.W. Norton Press. A review in Science describes Sexual Citizens as profoundly eye-opening, and the book was selected as one of NPR's best books of 2020. The research presented in Sexual Citizens was realized as part of Columbia's Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, co-directed by Jennifer and clinical psychologist Claude Ann Mellons. Today, we will have a discussion, and that discussion is going to be guided by two of our colleagues here at Dartmouth. Misty DeBerry is a senior lecturer and performance artist in women's and gender and sexuality studies. She has written critical essays and solo performances on gender-based violence in the lives of Black queer women. Misty has also advised student-led and local community initiatives engaged in healing circles and transformative justice practices. Mingwei Huang is an assistant professor also in WGSS. She works with the Sexual Assault Peer Alliance at Dartmouth. She has written about sexual violence and ethnography and has participated in a transformative justice accountability process. Misty and Mingwei have been affiliated with the Consortium for Race, Migration, and Sexuality and work with the Student and Presidential Committee on Sexual Assault. I'd like to thank the groups that came together to co-sponsor this event, in addition to the Program in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. They are the Student and Presidential Commission on Sexual Assault, the Ethics Institute, the Dartmouth Center for the Advancement of Learning, and the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences. For those who are faculty in the audience and who are watching, I will be moderating a discussion of the book at DCAL, the Dartmouth Center for the Advancement of Learning, on Tuesday, November 2nd, after you've had a little time to read, reflect, and digest, to think about the implications of this research and their recommendations for teaching at Dartmouth. Before we begin today's discussion, I want to offer you a little content warning. Before we begin, it's important to note that our discussion of Sexual Citizens will contain descriptions of actual sexual assaults as students experience them. This material can be hard to listen to, and we know that in every room, virtual or not, there are survivors. Someone will drop the RAIN hotline number in the chat window. I'll also write on the board. Please take care of yourselves and know that you are not alone. The RAIN hotline is 800-656-HOPE or 800-656-4673. Please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest visitors and our two moderators for today's panel.
Thank you, Lisa, for opening up the room for us all and specifically transitioning us here with a bit of a content warning It's really helpful to have a content warning to prepare ourselves, to help turn towards, settle in, and ground for what may be, what may or may not come up during our time together. And sometimes, as we talk about in my class specifically, the body communicates, elicits, or tells us stuff before, or perhaps more acutely felt than the mind. So I'm saying all this to say, I invite us to take just a few more minutes or moments to arrive a bit more fully into the room, into the presence of your own particular being, your own felt situatedness, and in the company of others. That said, you may want to lower your eyes for a moment or close your eyes if that feels comfortable. You might also want to bring your attention to your breath. Not doing anything fancy or clever. Rather, just turning your attention to yourself as a breathing apparatus. If that's not comfortable or available to you, perhaps you want to think about the sensation of your clothes laying against your flesh. Or else you may want to note the distinct sounds you can make out here or in your environment, listening for texture, rhythm, pitch, tone. And if possible, allow yourself to soften, letting your shoulders fall away from your ears. And give yourself the prompt to center, ground, take root. Thank you. You can let your eyes flutter open or return your gaze to the screen. So lastly, while these gentle practices can serve to ground you as we chat today, they can also serve to create a bit of a space or a container. So we welcome you while we're chatting today to pull on these practices of presencing, or else feel free to take a walk, get up and move around, get some fresh air, stretch, or you may find it helpful to draw or journal while we chat. With that, as we take root, I'm so excited and honored to just hear so many tools and ideas from you all. Mingwei, will you take us away?
Sure. So I learned so much from the ethnographic approach that you took in this book. So can you tell us a little bit about the SHIFT study and why you decided to write Sexual Citizens?
Sure, and first, Shamus and I are just so happy to be here. This is our second in-person event after a long series of Zoom webinars, and it is really nice to be in a room with other people who are not our families. We're going to open with a story. So Lucy had been pretty sheltered before she arrived on the Columbia campus. She'd gone to boarding school and had not had a boyfriend, and she had a clear picture of what she was hoping to have happen socially in those first few months of school. She wanted to meet some boys, to make out, and eventually to lose her virginity. And so it felt like it totally tracked when a girl in her hall, because that's how women on campus are referred to, a girl, Nancy, asked her if she wanted to go to a bar in Morningside Heights. They were not 21, but if you have even a pretty bad fake, it's not so hard to get into a bar as a girl. And so they went, and they met two seniors. One of them, Scott, chatted Lucy up, which felt thrilling, like, to get attention from an older man. He bought her drinks. They danced. He invited her back to the fraternity. She wanted to go with him. And so they walked up Amsterdam Avenue in the warm summer night, and her phone was ringing. And, she was hoping it wasn't her mom, but she looked and it was Nancy. Nancy had gotten what some of you may have gotten, that bystander intervention. And she was checking to make sure that her friend was okay. And so they waited outside the fraternity. Nancy caught up, and then they went inside. Scott offered them a drink. Fraternities aren't allowed to serve hard liquor at Columbia. Doesn't mean they don't do it. It just means they keep it upstairs. So they went upstairs. So just like picture the scene. Scott is in a building where he lives, surrounded by his friends, on a campus where he's been for 3 years. He knows how things roll. They're on a campus where they have just arrived, where the prime directive for first-year students is just to like not look stupid. And they're in his space. Nancy passed out right away, and he asked Lucy if she wanted to go up to his room, and she did. So they went upstairs, and they were making out, and it was all good until it wasn't. He started to unbutton her pants, and she was very clear. She said, "No, don't." To which he said, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. And when she told us that story, she had never named it as an assault to anyone. She told her roommate the next day, but as if it were like just some crazy thing that happens during orientation week where you lose your virginity to a total stranger, because she felt like it was her fault. And you know, Shamus and I know how that story lands. And we're sure there are people in this room who are thinking like, we have to find people like Scott and get them out of our community. And not entirely a bad take, because what Scott did was very harmful. And yet, if that's where the conversation ends, we're not going to move towards safety. And so we started the research that we share in Sexual Citizens, and we wrote Sexual Citizens to change the national conversation about campus sexual assault, which has been very focused on the idea of campuses as a hunting ground, and as people who commit sexual assault as broken people. And those perspectives have some truth in them, and yet, you know, we're in public health. We want to think about prevention. And so Sexual Citizens lays out a vision of how campus sexual assault is actually built into the college environment. Like, it is a predictable consequence of how student life is organized, which sounds very grim in some way, because you're like, oh, we built an assaultogenic machine. Except once you see how it's built in, you can develop a vision of how to engineer it out. And so that's what we hope to do with Sexual Citizens, not through an approach that says, be afraid, be very afraid, but instead by centering the stories of students with hope and empathy and a vision towards a transformational approach to prevention.
It's very insightful. Thank you, Jennifer, for getting us going. Specific to the project, I really enjoyed the key terms you used to ground the study, or your primary 3 key terms, that being sexual citizenship, sexual projects, and then specifically I really took to sexual geographies, which I really just kind of appreciate this type of everyday sexual spatial banalities almost that are mitigated through institutional uses of domestic furniture, right? So they're really creative and also was really helpful in me and my class in participating in your analysis. And the terms themselves are also very specific. You've given us citizens, projects, geographies, as a lens through which you make sense of sexual assault. So can you share what these ideas do, how they interact with each other, as well as why these specific terms rather than any other?
Sure. So like Jennifer, I'll tell a story of Charisma to sort of highlight these 3 ideas. When we talked to Charisma, she described Columbia and Barnard as a white institution or a white space. And when we asked what she meant by that, paraphrasing her, she said, well, it's filled with white guys who drink too much, can't dance, listen to shitty music, and just don't find me attractive. And clearly Charisma didn't find these guys attractive either, nor did she find their way of socializing. And so she talked to her roommate who was from New York and ended up being connected with a guy that her roommate knew who lived out in Brooklyn. And Morningside Heights and Brooklyn are not terribly far away, but one Saturday, she decided to go meet this guy. And it was one of those terrible New York subway weekends where it took her a couple hours to get out there. She was soaking wet. She got to his place somewhat miraculously, peeled off some of her clothes so that they could dry out, had a drink with him, smoked part of a joint, and they were sitting on the couch together. Everything was fine, sort of similar to the Scott and Lucy story, until he put his hand on her leg and on her body in a place she didn't want it. She moved his hand away, and he put it right back. And she said, I never really had a plan B. My plan A was body language, and it had always worked before. And so she was assaulted in that situation. Now, you could read the story just as the Scott and Lucy story as, wow, that guy, what a terrible person. But as Jennifer said, what we want to do is shift our understanding from terrible people, which is an individual level approach, to a much more public health understanding, which locates the analysis within sort of history, institutions, organizational environments. In part because people are really hard to change, but contexts are not as hard to change. And if you can change a context, there's more you can do. So sexual projects is the idea. It emerges out of some of Jennifer's earlier work that it's really the answer to the question, what is sex for? And you might think like, wow, only 2 academics could ask a question like, what is sex for? But think about it for a minute. Like, what is it for? And, none of the people that we spoke to were seeking to have children, so clearly wasn't for reproduction. Maybe pleasure, but as we learned, not all the sex was pleasurable, and actually there's a well-demonstrated campus orgasm gap, a gender difference in sexual pleasure in college campuses. Sometimes it was for coming to understand yourself, like particularly for LGBTQIA students, part of a status project. If you've ever used the idea of being out of somebody's league, you're basically saying that sex is about your position within a hierarchy and where you belong. Or it was just like to try something new. Lucy had a sexual project, to make out, meet some boys, and finally lose her virginity. It was a very clear sexual project. So one of the things that we argue is that in order to understand why assaults happen, you need to understand what people are trying to do when they're having sex. And as it turns out, they're doing lots of different things, which is why assaults are really hard to address, because it's not one thing, it's many different things. Sexual citizenship is the idea that we all have the right to sexual self-determination, that we have the right to say yes to sex, the right to say no to sex, and an obligation to recognize the equivalent rights in others. In some ways, this is a provocation, because what we're saying is that young people at colleges and universities and really everywhere have the right to sexual self-determination. Many of them emerge from communities where that simply isn't the case. So if we were to take the charisma story for a second, we see that charisma, and this is part of a long arc of stories that we tell of hers in the book, has no clarity on her sexual project. It's basically all trial and error. And that was a community level failure. It was basically a failure where nobody spent any time talking to her about how sex would be a valuable part of her life, and she needed to figure out what she wanted from it, and she should be intentional in that. There was a profound failure of sexual citizenship in that room as well, which is the man that she was with, who effectively denied her fundamental moral equivalence as a human being. We see the same thing in the Scott and Lucy story that Jennifer told, where Scott, when he says it's okay, isn't just sort of rejecting her statement. He's actually denying her fundamental equivalent personhood. He's saying I have the right to sexual self-determination, but you don't. The final concept, sexual geographies, is, as you indicated, kind of the one that a lot of spaces have picked up on, and it's that place matters. Sex actually happens in spaces, and college campuses, and communities in general, organize space in particular ways that allow for interventions. When I opened by saying that Charisma described Columbia and Barnard as a white institution, I didn't do that for affect to pull you in. It was actually part of a broader analysis of how the whiteness of campus space put Charisma at risk. Our argument here isn't that Brooklyn is a dangerous place. I was born in Brooklyn. Jennifer and I are from New York. It's that by being driven off campus in seeking places to socialize, she was put at risk. The second idea is about race and space, and that when we think about spatial dynamics, race and power are intimately intertwined. And I'm sure, as we'll talk about in a little bit, the way that whiteness and control over the spaces of socialization on campus are intertwined has profound effects for students of color. The final element of space was something that we saw fairly consistent, which was about space and class. So this is sort of layering an intersectional understanding onto our analysis through the concept of space. You know, Charisma wasn't like other students. She couldn't just like open up her phone, open up an app, and get a car to take her back to Morningside Heights. It's a $50 car ride. She didn't have $50. And one of the profound things that Jennifer and I saw again and again was how even in a campus like Columbia and Barnard, which has an incredibly wealthy student population, the diversification of that campus over the last 30 and 40 years has also brought a series of challenges in relationship to class that the institutions haven't really figured out ways to design, and that's part of the geography of campus. We heard other stories like a young man named Sadeep who was queer, not able to be out to his family, and over the winter break basically figured out spaces on and around campus that he could sleep in so that he could stay on the subway all night and be awake in safety because he didn't really have anywhere to live. And like that dynamic was an integral dynamic to the risks that he experienced on campus, which were grounded in his class position. And so space and power relate to gender and power, race and class, and we sort of see that through the lens of geography.
Well, I actually want to pick up on this idea of sexual geographies in space, race, gender, class. So there's a bit of a kind of a comment too about thinking about the now in terms of how COVID has profoundly altered the sexual geographies of campuses. And just, you know, in your book, you speak about how sexual assault is so situational and contextual. But in this moment, we're also, you know, returning to campus after a year of isolation. That also kind of makes all of these kind of idiosyncratic factors kind of can make an increase in sexual assault predictable. Which, so just to, you know, thinking through. You know, I read a piece in Inside Higher Education that right now students have an altered sense of risk because of the pandemic and kind of a different relationship to alcohol in the way that I think a lot of people have been coping with pandemic uncertainty with alcohol. And now there's, with the return to campus, there's now kind of two classes of students entering campus who are unfamiliar with kind of the, you know, the space and power and these dynamics. And here, as people here acutely know, there's been really an acute shortage of on-campus housing and kind of anxiety about housing security, housing insecurity. Also in this kind of more rural setting, we don't have much public transit or rideshare apps, and kind of who has, you know, access to cars and certain kinds of mobility and where people are going off campus has a lot to do with class and also race. And on this campus, it's there's massive wealth gaps and also you know, a lot of racial stratification as this historically very white institution kind of diversifies its student body. So that's a long comment, but I was wondering if you could just elaborate more on your idea of sexual geographies and you know, why space matters so much, how thinking about space provides opportunities for prevention. And then this is very kind of an unfair question because the pandemic is still unfolding, but just thoughts about how thinking about how the pandemic has altered kind of campus sexual geographies or kind of changed how we kind of do our work now.
I mean, one of the reasons that sexual geographies is so good to think with when you think about sexual assault prevention is that our A game in public health is not telling people to be better people, right? Think about clean water. Like, it doesn't matter how concerned you are about bacteria in your water. Like, you turn on the tap, water comes out. Like, it's a miracle, right? It's a very unequally distributed miracle because there are many people in the United States who lack access to clean water. There are, you know, billions of people around the world. So that's another speech. But so the engineering that we've done around clean water points to the power of public health, which is an environmental, community-level intervention. And sexual geographies moves your focus in sexual assault prevention away from gathering up students during orientation and telling them not to assault each other, into thinking about how is that behavior socially patterned? How can we reimagine the environment? In particular, like think about the Scott and Lucy story, right? That we have at Columbia Barnard, at many schools, housing policies mean that as students get more senior, they have better access to housing. As students get more senior, they have more space that they can control to host parties. They are less heavily policed because they tend to be over the drinking age, and so they can serve alcohol at their parties if they want to. The serving of alcohol is heavily gendered because fraternities but not sororities can serve alcohol. So it's a sort of a concatenation of policies that drive less powerful students into spaces controlled by more powerful students. And does it make those more powerful students bad people, right? Like both my sons are white, cis hetero young men, right? They're excellent. But it's like going through the world with size 13 feet. Like you are just more likely to step on someone's foot, right? And so we can take that insight and then reimagine how space is allocated on campus, so that there's one campus that we're working for where the best suites, which had gone to the captains of the sports teams, went to, this wasn't the choice that we would make, but they would students with the highest GPAs. We would have said, like, those suites, give them to first-gen students, give them to queer students of color, like all the most minoritized identities, try to organize space on your campus so that it mitigates inequalities rather than amplifying them. So that's what sexual geographies does, is it helps you think about how you can use space on campus to address power relations, rather than, it's not saying like, this is it's not hotspot mapping, which looks at like specific spaces where assaults occur, but rather it points to the fundamental power inequalities on campus and gives a policy tool for redress.
That's well said, Dr. Hirsch. I really appreciate it, and the ways in which you and Dr. Khan in your book and in your conversation today are really centering the notion of power, the use of power, and along those lines of thought, Dr. Khan, you talk about, the both of you, the role of power in sex and sexual assault. Can you speak to what you were able to reveal about the way that race, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and other social identities can influence the likelihood of sexual assault?
Sure. I mean, Jennifer and I build on decades, generations of research on sexual assault, which have basically talked about sexual assault as a product of gender and power, the imbalance of gender power relations in a context. And, there's sort of two insights that we bring, that we layer onto this. The first is that gender is not the only form of power on campus. And thinking about sexual assault as gender-based violence sort of limits our understanding of how and why sexual assault happens in campus spaces. And part of the limitation is, if we think about recent intellectual developments in an understanding of gender, building upon the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, our colleague at Columbia, who developed the concept of intersectionality, it's that you can't really understand gender without also understanding racial dynamics or class dynamics or ability or sexuality. So, to make that a little bit more concrete, when Jennifer and I were analyzing the data, so the data come from multiple different sources. We interviewed 151 students, spending hours with them. For 25 of them, we did follow-up interviews. We also had embedded ethnographers, so younger people than Jennifer and me, who hung out at parties, who were at fraternity and sorority events, who were in students' living room spaces, making dinner and playing Catan, who were on intramural sports leagues, who were engaged in religious student life, always publicly, but it gave us sort of a portrait of what it's like to be a college student today. And, in that analysis, Jennifer and I think were kind of blown away by a fact that maybe we shouldn't have been blown away by, but was that every single black woman that we spoke to told us a story of unwanted sexualized touching. Every single one. And frequently they didn't tell it as a story of assault. It was like another indignity experienced as part of being on campus life. And you can't understand that as gender-based violence, right? It's actually a violence grounded in anti-black racism and the view of those black women's bodies as just something that isn't like really legitimately owned by those women or can be touched in ways without consent that's like totally normal. And so that sort of opened up our eyes in the analysis to thinking about how these intersections, these multiple sort of power intersections worked, where if we recognize that gender is an intersectional concept, and if we recognize that there are multiple sources of social power on campus, then we might begin to sort of open up our analysis beyond just gender-based violence to think about how the structure of inequality on campuses, the way that we frequently build inequalities into campus life, are integral to why sexual assaults happen. But it's not just the structure of inequality on campus. It's also the inequalities that come way before campus that we have to think about. So, Adam, a young man that we spoke to, was like from a super conservative family, couldn't be out to them. And he was like he was thrilled to move to New York because he was like, yay, I can be out, I can have sex, it's gonna be wonderful. And then he got to New York and he was like, wow, this is terrible because Adam wanted a relationship. Like a lot of the values of his family were things that he still held dear, which was about commitment and love. And what he found is that like New York gay men were awful. Like they like just like would hit him back up on Grindr, be like, yeah, I'm happy to meet up with him and then ghost him, right? Even if they said they were into a relationship, like he'd never hear from them again. And so he told us about how happy he was to finally be in a relationship. And he described this relationship in like really, really sentimental and loving ways. Except, Adam said that sometimes my boyfriend's really forceful about sex. And then he told us a story about how his boyfriend came home one night drunk, and in Adam's words, he basically raped me. Adam didn't describe it fully as a rape. He wouldn't allow he resisted its categorization as that way. He never talked to his friends about it. And the question would be like, where does that silence come from? Where does the silence about being unable to actually speak about that experience come from? And part of it is grounded in the denial of his sexual citizenship by his family and by the community that he came from. That like, just feeling like one's own sexuality is an illegitimate sexuality, that you don't have the right to sexual self-determination and same-sex sexual relationships, undermined his capacity to think about, express his own sexual wants and desires. Within the broader queer community, we heard other things. Maddie was one of the people that we spoke to, and Maddie was assigned male at birth, transitioned in her gender identity, and Maddie was in a relationship with a woman who, was there for Maddie as she went through her gender transition. But Maddie's girlfriend consistently pressured her to use her penis during sex. And like, Maddie didn't want to use her penis during sex. But she described it as a kind of like war of attrition, where her partner's wants overtook her needs and desires. In another instance of a trans student, they were transitioning, their partner was transitioning, and their partner said to them at one point in time, because they weren't really like feeling super sexual, super attractive, their sexual libido was kind of not very high at the time, you don't think I'm beautiful. And so their partner, like when they said this, they were like, wow, like I know how deep it cuts when you're genderqueer to feel like you are not beautiful because you do not adhere to like the standards and understanding of what beauty is. And so they made a decision to just have non-consensual sex because they thought that is the less harm in this situation. Like me being assaulted is better than doing like compounding the harms of this other genderqueer person's feelings about their lack of beauty because of their gender identity. And like, making sense of that story requires us to see how, I think two things. Like the first is that you don't have to have power to use power, right? Like when we do an analysis of power, we're like, who's powerful on campus? Well, it's the white straight dudes, right? They're powerful. But like there are all kinds of ways in which power can move through a community, can be used by people through that war of attrition or through that you don't think I'm beautiful. This explains why like the queer community has some of the highest rates of assault. It's not just toxic masculinity that's producing that. It's grounded in power inequities located within like a deep kind of homophobia that these queer and trans students and gay and lesbian students have had to deal with. And so what that does is it sort of like changes our lens a little bit from just thinking about like masculinity and power and how that's bad to saying like, okay, yes, and like, let's think about how power works throughout all of our community. And like institutions are not gonna eliminate like racism in the world or homophobia in the world, but they can think about like, what would an institutional design look like that didn't just augment those inequalities, that didn't just like take like heterosexuality and whiteness and masculinity and be like, well, we're gonna make sure that those people have the most control over socialization spaces on campus. And as Jennifer said, like that is not a thing where those people are bad people. It's instead like a really weird system that we have built where we have decided that all of the inequalities that come to us before campus life are things that we're not even just gonna mitigate, we're actually gonna augment. We're gonna try and increase the inequalities. And that is a troubling thing, but again, as Jennifer said, like, once you see that, you can be like, well, we don't have to ban people. Like what we can do is redesign our environments in different ways that don't do this thing, that actually have a different kind of approach to them.
Thank you.
So on this topic of, about not banning people and getting out of the terrible people kind of paradigm, so I just want to turn to kind of a couple of the later chapters in the book where you highlight the need for conversations about restorative and transformative justice, in addition to better sexual education throughout young people's lives. It's a community project. I also found the chapter about the power of the group to be really illuminating. So in this chapter, you show that assault is rarely limited to the relationship between individual perpetrators and survivors. Rather, it pulls in like their whole social worlds, which are often really overlapping, especially at a small kind of campus like Dartmouth. So in this book, in these chapters, they write about how sometimes, friends in the same group can facilitate sexual encounters. They can also intervene in potential assaults. People who have been assaulted might not want to bring it up because of pressure from friends. So I found this really useful. And so, here, I know there's some student initiatives, thinking about restorative justice and how to repair harm that happens within student communities because it's never kind of over after it happens. And so these processes also provide alternative avenues for students who have expressed like distrust in like the local police, campus safety and security, and how the administration handles investigations. Long comment. So also taking into consideration like the calls to defund and abolish the police, gaining recent mainstream attention. Can you speak more to these ideas about restorative and transformative justice and how we as a society can shape sexual citizenship with a new set of values?
So this is not a problem that we can punish our way out of, right? I mean, decades of the disaster of mass incarceration, as well as a great deal of criminological research, have shown that punishment does not lead to community transformation. Punishment exacerbates inequalities and falls most harshly on the least privileged. You think about the Adam story that Shamus shared. So what we've built is a system, or what exists is a system where there's no feedback loop through which people who harm sometimes the people they care about are ever told that they're like, this sex thing that you're doing it wrong. You're doing it in a way that really hurts people. In fact, you're assaulting them. And so while we didn't study Columbia's system of adjudication, we can tell you from the broader project that I led with Claude had a survey, and in that survey, less than 5%, I think 3% of students who'd been assaulted reported it. And so even if we got those cases perfect, and I mean, Columbia is not an outlier in that. Like in general, people are very reluctant to make a formal report for all sorts of good reasons. And so even if those adjudications were handled in a way that was most fair and least damaging, it wouldn't really help, right? Like so other people who are lawyers should fix that system. But what we want to do is prevent the other 97% of assaults from happening. And so that involves teaching people how to have sex without hurting other people. Like, think about driving. Driving, as a parent, both of my sons have learned to drive recently, it is terrifying, right? You like put these young people in a 2-ton vehicle and you're like, sure, move around the world, that's a great idea. But there's a whole system to make driving less dangerous. And in fact, rates of teen fatality related to driving have fallen by 75% over the past decades. Rates of sexual assault have not fallen by 75% over the past decade. So there's a whole system for making people into safe drivers, people who can get where they're going without hurting other people. And we do actually have a technology that could kind of do that with sexual assault, which is sex education. Another thing that we found in our research, this is an analysis of the survey data led by my husband, John Santelli, shout out to John. So the analysis that he did of the survey data, which looked at the things before college that protect against sexual assault, found that women who had had comprehensive sex education were half as likely to be raped in college. Think about that, half as likely. I don't know any math statistics people out there, that is a really big effect size. That is the target effectiveness that we were hoping for with the COVID vaccine. So we essentially, there is a vaccine already for sexual assault. And at the state level, legislators have chosen mostly not to make it available. So there's still states in America where if sex ed is provided, it must be homophobic. Not only can it not mention anything about LGBTQ people, but if it does, it must mention it in a negative light. So so the situation about sex education is highly unequitable. If you went to a fancy, progressive private school, you may have gotten very good sex education. But most of the students, when we ask them about sex education, they're like, oh, you mean my sexual diseases class, the one that tried to scare me from having sex. And so that's a message that undermines young people's sexual citizenship. We don't do that with driving. When young people want to drive, we don't say, not under my roof. And we don't let them just grab the keys when they're drunk and figure it out, right? Because that would be a system of harm. And that is the system that we, as parents, as citizens, have allowed to exist, so we shouldn't be surprised that people hurt each other so much because we're not teaching them to do better.
Mindy and Mingwei have lots of great questions to ask, but I'm going to invite the audience to ask questions of their own, and I believe Tyler, you're monitoring the YouTube live stream, and if questions come up from that you'd like to pose, please share them with them. There's a mic being passed around, so we invite you to ask questions.
Thanks so much. I have a quick question about sexual geographies and fundraising and advancement. It's always struck me, So it's always struck me that a visionary college president might do something like raise money to expand sorority basements to reallocate social spaces along some of the lines you've described. And I could think of sort of like, my classes have often thought of 15 other ways to do things like this if they were sort of visionary college presidents. And I'm just wondering if you've seen sort of any fundraising or advancement energy to reallocate space and power in the ways that you've described. It strikes me as sort of low-hanging fruit for fundraising.
I mean, in the Greek life system, the first thing that would have to happen is a change in national rule of the Hellenic Council, so that Greek life, under the national umbrella of Greek life, mandates that sororities can't serve alcohol. And so that effectively gives men control over the spaces where the distribution of alcohol happens. And like, that is something that I think wouldn't happen on the level of say, just a basement in a sorority, but it's something that I think is ripe for an intervention, right? To say like, this is profoundly inequitable, this is actually causing harm, there's something that we could do about this. You know, I think I want to have like two answers to this, yes and. So like my yes is like, yeah, absolutely. If you think about the range of things where you could bring in a wide variety of stakeholders to think about what it would mean to create spaces of equity in campus that isn't just about sexual assault, it's about general well-being of a student body, particularly in wealthier institutions for more diverse student bodies, where just accepting students from a diverse set of backgrounds is totally insufficient. What you have to do is also like fundamentally redesign the spaces. So if I invited you to like come and move into my house, but I was like, but you can't touch anything. Like you can sit on my couch, and if you want a different couch, go to hell, right? Like if this is the couch that's in the house, and like you may want a different TV, but like this is my TV, and like this is now our TV. That's actually not a welcoming orientation. It's actually a kind of hostility to the people that you're bringing in. And so I think it is part of the conversation where like financial aid as a pathway to sort of class diversification is not enough. There needs to be equivalent funding for a range of other initiatives that are a part of that. And so, that's a pretty big lift, but I think there's one thing I really like about the lift. And what Jennifer and I say is that like, instead of thinking about sexual assault prevention as the job of like the Dean of Students and the Title IX office, what would it mean to envision it as like everybody's job? In our research, the way that we designed the broad research project was to have a community-based participatory research model. And what that means from a research perspective is that we had 2 advisory boards. One advisory board of institutional people. So that was like the Office of the Dean of Students, Counseling and Psychological Services, the people who were responsible for orientation, of course, the people from like Title IX, but also the head of housing and dining. And Scott Wright, the head of housing and dining, I'm sure for a while was like, why am I here? Like, why am I in the sexual assault space? There were sort of 2 reasons why he was there. One, he was in control of an enormous amount of space that like students used and were having sex in. So he was critical to the intervention. And then the second was like, what would it mean for him to think about himself as a sexual assault prevention actor? And in listening to Jennifer give a presentation about sort of sexual geographies, he had like an aha moment. And he was like, oh, this is really interesting. And the presentation was basically like, what happens when 2 young people are out at the bars or they're at a party and the party ends and the bars close? They've got to go back to a room. But when they go back to that room, whose room are they going to go back to? Well, they're going to go back to a room of the person who has a single, right? And who has singles? Well, more senior people have singles. And as it turns out, sexual patterning in heterosexual relationships is heavily gendered in that like older women senior women tend not to hook up with freshman men, right? Like that is not a thing, but the other is actually really common. So they're gonna go back to like the guy's room, and then like when they open the door to that room, what do they see? A desk, a chair, a bureau, and a bed. Where are you gonna sit? Well, you're gonna sit on the bed, and like it or not, beds have social meetings. And that doesn't like cause assaults, but we heard many stories of women who said, I just kind of gave him a blowjob to get out of there. Like performing oral sex as a way to exit the situation of the room. And so Scott hears probably not this complete story, but a version of the story. And he's like, you know what? We have a dining hall that's actually like, in the basement of one of the dorms. I could keep it open all night on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Like when students are faced with a choice of where to go, so that students have an option to say, actually, like, can we go to JJ's instead and like grab some fries? And like, is that going to prevent all assaults? No, Absolutely not. But it's the kind of approach where like you're doing a couple things. You're like thinking in a geographic and spatial analysis. You're bringing in a range of stakeholders so that like the development people can begin to think like, we can pitch to the people we're trying to raise money for that you can give money to prevent sexual assault and also have your name on a building, right? And it begins to think about like, what would it look like to have a community level, multi-pronged commitment to prevention? And that's sort of what we're asking people to do. I had more answers, but I'm blathering on, so I'll let, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to share, as you gather your questions here in the audience and online, we should make you aware that we are a mandatory reporting campus. So as you gather the questions you may want to share with us today, be mindful of that, the space that you are in. So just keep that in mind. And we welcome your questions, and you're more than welcome to share a thought as well. We just ask that perhaps, unlike our questions, you be a bit concise. Thank you.
Okay, this question comes from YouTube. I know someone who was systematically raped during a long-term relationship. He struggles to be okay with being sexually active now because of his trauma. Any advice on how to be there for him? And there's a follow-up.
Such an important, and my heart goes out to the person who asked the question. We're so sorry that their friend experienced that harm. And this is something that came through for us so powerfully in the research, was the community level mental health burden of sexual assault. Because if by senior year, 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 6 men, and actually much higher proportion of gender non-binary students have experienced assault, then all of their partners are contending with that, and they're contending with it, and the people who they tell are their friends. So there's the question that the student asked about how to be a friend to somebody who suffered harm is a question that really a lot of students are struggling with. In one really upsetting story from the book, a student shared with us that they had sort of worked up their courage to tell the story of their assault to a friend, who then responded with what they perceived to be a much worse story. And they're like, I can't share this with my friend because my friend is totally tapped out dealing with their own thing. And so I think it's hard for students to distinguish between a time when being a friend means holding someone suffering and a time when being a friend means making sure that they get professional support, right? And so I think that, helping students think about, you might call it like social triage. Like, when is the thing that you need to do for your friend to be, I will sit with you while you call counseling and psychological services, and I will make sure that you speak with a trained advocate, not because I don't love you, but because I do love you. And I don't know what to say. So there's all sorts of elementary things, like when someone tells you they've been harmed, believe them, right? So that's like 101 level. But I think 102 level is maybe they need something that no matter how much you care about them, you can't give. And so I think making sure, and then on the part of the institution, it means making sure that the people on the other end of that phone line represent the diversity of the student community, right? So if you have a bunch of old white men in counseling, I love old white men, but if that's all you have providing clinical services, there are going to be people who might miss out on really important pieces of students' lived experience and will potentially have a harder time connecting. So I think that there's a student part of that question, and then there's a institutional responsibility part of that question. It's a really important question.
I'm curious if I can jump in real quick. Your response here, if you came along in your participant conversations, if any of the participants shared practices that they are taking up as a mode of recovery outside of institutional procedures. Did any of your participants share ways in which that they're helping, supporting one another, reimagining healing with their particular resources? Any examples of that?
It wasn't really something that we particularly looked at. What was pretty clear in the support that students had that was positive, even if after they'd had really challenging experiences, was, sort of I think these are two things that are deeply interrelated. Students whose parents had talked to them about sex in ways that were open had much better pathways to start a conversation. Those students whose parents conveyed to them that they shouldn't be having sex couldn't possibly talk to their parents about assaults. It was very, very difficult. But a second part of that was that we didn't hear a single story about a positive interaction with a father post-assault. The only one we heard was one of harm, where it was actually a bisexual man who told his father he'd been assaulted by a woman, and the father was like, that's just not a thing. Like, that's just not a possible thing, and it was sort of blown off. The harm wasn't even like conceivable. And so I think like what I would take away from that is, one, I mean, you know, in families, like men need to step up in having open conversations about sex and sexuality that aren't just about protecting their children from having sex when like their children want to have sex, and are actually open conversations that indicate like, if you are harmed or if there's something that happens to you, like it's gonna be hard for me to have this conversation, but like the space is there for us. So I think that would be one of the notable things that I would say. And then the second is that like, you know, the concept of sexual projects, about clarity about what you want out of your sexual experiences. Like some of the challenges that people had consistently was that the only lessons that they had received about sex and sexuality was like, we don't talk about this. I don't want to talk about it. Like I'm gonna put my fingers in my ears and say la 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 la. And like, you know, this was both a problem for assaults, that how do we possibly imagine that if the only thing we've taught people about sex is that we don't talk about it, how do we imagine that they're going to be capable of expressing themselves and their sexual desires? But it's also a problem of like, you know, any kind of communication. And I would say, I mentioned this earlier, like I would ask to the students here, like how many of you have had the following conversation? Like, you really need to focus on your grades because you got to get into the right college. Once you get into the right college, you have to pick the right major. And you have to really focus on your work because it's really important for you to get the right internship. And that internship is going to set the pathway onto your job. And that is what's important, right? Set up your career because that's what's going to determine your lot in life. My guess is it's maybe not been that stark, but there's been a version of that. And I would ask if there's ever been an equivalent conversation that says sex is going to be a really important part of your life. It's going to be one of the ways that you connect with the people who are most important to you, your spouses, partners, etc. You need to start valuing that. You need to think about what you want from that part of your life. And you need to ask how you're going to do it and how you're going to prioritize that. One of the things that we saw again and again and again was not just silence over sex and sexuality, but its continual deprioritizing by institutions and communities and not valuing things like commitment, etc. And I would say that like, you know, what Jennifer and I claim is that like, it's not a problem with the young people today. Like, it's actually a problem with the systems that the older people, us, in their life have created, where we've basically said like, focus on what's important, which is your job as a worker, not on other things like your interpersonal relationships, your connections, and who you are and how you're going to be in those contexts. And like, that is a real damage, and it's a real damage grounded in the silence around sex and sexuality in our kind of particularly, you know, puritanical WASP culture around that aspect of America.
Thank you. Any more questions online or one over here?
I was wondering, this is like a frustration I've read about, and I've also experienced myself, and I know others have experienced in sexual violence prevention at Dartmouth. So much of the time, this kind of individual approach and kind of a reactionary approach falls on the shoulders of those more at risk, you know, like female students, students of color, queer students, et cetera. And like how, I don't know, I was curious if you had advice on how to bring people in and understanding like we're changing the conditions, like everyone will have access to like, or everyone will be able to have their sexual citizenship and like endeavor in their sexual projects, like how to bring people in who do have access to these or do feel power in these spaces where there's alcohol, like how to bring those people into the movement and understand like it will be better for everyone.
It would be better for everyone. I mean, so I think a reframe, we're not recommending that the ineffective approach to sexual assault prevention of telling people not to assault each other is moved from the people at risk to the people who will assault. For two reasons. Like, first of all, it's still ineffective, right? Like, so you're wasting money on a 1 hour or a PowerPoint that people click through. Like, we really know, both as general education and in public health in terms of behavior change, we really know that that doesn't work. And so institutions that use that as their primary mode of prevention, that's a compliance mindset. That's saying, like, we're doing prevention, we're gonna check the box, yes, we told them not to rape each other, we're all good, right? And so, like, changing that so that it emphasizes people who you might think of as the more likely assaulters, still a waste of money and not gonna make an impact. And people, there's not a distinction between people who are assaulters and people who are not assaulters. Heterosexual men experience sexual assault. Women assault heterosexual men, not in the same rates and not in the same absolute numbers. And one of the biggest risk factors for committing sexual assault is having been assaulted yourself. And so I think rather than, we just want to move people totally out of the mindset of lecturing at people because it doesn't work. And instead to really think radically about, okay, we know sexual assault reflects power inequalities. What can we do to mitigate those underlying power inequalities rather than yakking at people? And so, and I think that, you know, you might translate, like, what does it look like to mitigate those underlying power inequalities? Well, if what it looks like is shutting down the frats, then it's gonna be hard to bring people in who actually like live in those buildings and are very attached to them. And so at wealthy universities like Dartmouth, what it could look like is building other spaces, repurposing underused social spaces. So it's not about necessarily taking anyone's house away. It's about making sure that everyone has a house, which is a thing that is eminently doable on a wealthy campus like this.
Could I follow up with a question along those lines? And I thought that was a really thought-provoking question. Thanks for asking it. So many of the students here are here with a class, WGSS 10. And so it's very easy to see how your book can be folded into the curriculum of that particular class and lots of other classes. I'm thinking about classes that are not social science, they're not public health, they're not talking about gender or sexuality in any way. How do you see them kind of equivalent to the dining services story, professors in other fields, learning from this book and bringing something important into their teaching?
You don't like me, okay. It's a great question. It's actually not something I've thought about before, so you'll see me do it on my feet a little bit. I mean, one of the things we don't recommend is that like every professor bring this into their classroom. And we don't recommend that because like, I don't know, like I don't want most of my colleagues teaching sex ed. Like, I mean, I don't want to teach sex ed. Like I am not trained to teach sex ed. Like I don't have any professional capacity to do it. Like there are people who have skills and like they should be doing those things. But I would say that there are lots of things that people say in labs could think about in terms of the organization of their lab space or the organization of their curriculum that could be kind of helpful. So if you think about labs, they're like frequently highly hierarchically structured organizations. And the hierarchy of that organization isn't a necessary way that the lab needs to be organized, but it is a way that it's organized. And so one of the things I would ask is like, how is it that in our range of classes, we build in hierarchy to the institution? And like, this is something that at elite schools happens again and again and again and again. And like, Dartmouth is Dartmouth in part because it's an elite institution. And that eliteness is something that gets layered again and again into the structure of the organization. So there's awards and there's ways in which we try to consistently create these hierarchical levels that talk about the values of people in a very specific way. So the first thing I would say is what would it look like to restructure that? The second would be for those faculty who are in those positions, one of the things that they can do is not student-oriented, but administration-oriented. And we had a student who told us, I've never had a faculty member who looked like me in one of my classes. This was a student in the School of Engineering who was African-American, and it was a very, very big problem. And I think one of the things that departments and areas of the institution can do is to ask do our faculty look like our students? And if they don't look like our students, what are we doing to correct that? Because maybe we're not creating spaces where we're hearing about the sets of things that are of concern or of issue among the student body. And that is not so much about what you're doing in your curriculum as it is what you're doing with your staffing and things like that. And I think, the final thing I'll say about all of this is that when you open up this space of thinking about the value of the diversification of your community, in part to create, a set of connections between students and faculty, in part as a broader commitment to equity, in part as a vision of particular kinds of excellence, I think some of what you have to recognize is that when you do that, it is going to be more contentious. And we know this about diverse communities. Diverse communities, there's a lot of evidence that on their decision making, are the decisions better or worse? And the evidence seems to suggest that they're a little bit better. What we don't talk about as much is diverse communities have way more tension. They just have more tension. And that is not a bad thing. And one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is how can we live in that as a community and recognize that the people who are traditionally powerful within this institution are going to lose their place on the top of the hierarchy. And one of the ways to do that is to invert the pyramid, and another way to do it is to get rid of the pyramid. And I think we need to ask, what is our pathway? And what Jennifer and I are suggesting is get rid of the pyramid. Think about what it would look like to have less hierarchically structured organization. Maybe you have a better answer to what people in the sciences should do?
I mean, I think the question, there are lots of different ways of thinking about the question, but what is the role of faculty in general in student life? Right? It is truly a bizarre idea that kids should leave home at 18 and go off and live with total strangers and be stripped out of, where are the adults in their life, right? And so I think that there's a role that faculty have as adults, not as substitute parents, but just as other people that students can connect with. So I think that structures, and there's a lot of variability in this across peer institutions, the extent to which faculty are encouraged to spend time, to eat with students, right? So to give, what is the structures that give faculty access to students and students access to faculty? That's not about sexual citizenship, it's about citizenship, right? It's about moments of being seen and moments of inclusion. So I think that that's not every institution is committed to allocating faculty time to undergraduates, but to the extent that it is, that is part of the mental health infrastructure. In the same way that students told us, in very moving ways, how the cafeteria workers, knowing their names, so cheered them up when they were feeling down. I think faculty knowing their students' names would also be nice, right? And that doesn't happen in giant lecture classes. So I think that there are ways in which there are messages in the book that are not about sex, but about community building and inclusion. And I would want faculty to read the book and think about what they're doing to build a community where every student feels seen.
Better.
Hi. I guess in response to the conversation about less hierarchical structure, I have a question about burnout.
About what? I'm sorry.
Burnout?
Okay.
Is that loud enough? Yeah? Okay. And I apologize if I don't articulate this in the most great way. But I think I wonder something that a lot of students and also faculty and staff experience on campus, that a lot of survivors and a lot of folks who've experienced harm or who really care about it put in so much effort and time. And I think with an administration that doesn't necessarily prioritize it in a mental health setting, or an administration that prioritizes it in a legal or priority mindset, I'm wondering how do we create spaces of healing for the folks who are doing the work so as to not create more turnover for the people who are supporting students to begin with. Sorry, I get shaky.
I think that survivor activists have pushed so hard for so long and have done an extraordinary job at creating awareness. Like when I was in college, there was one Take Back the Night march a year, and that was it, right? And we were on the margins, and the rest of the year, just be quiet, please don't talk about that. You have your day, you have one night. And so survivor activists have really been extraordinary at driving a whole national public policy conversation. And they should get to rest too, right? And so I think that the extent to which universities only move forward when they're pushed by students is really problematic, right? We would like to see administrations not need to be needled by people who have already suffered substantial harm in order to make changes. So I think that the whole framing of what can we do to address burnout, you shouldn't have to keep carrying the torch, right? The administration, it is really their job to pick that torch up and to think about what it would look like to move from compliance to transformation. And then I think your question also points to the intersection between sexual assault prevention and what Shamus and I describe as sort of the community level production of mental health, right? The administrative answer to the student mental health crisis has been to staff up at counseling and psychological services, which is important, right? Students need access to trained clinicians, but I remember Shamus and I were touring one of the dorms with a student, and we were in the lounge space in the basement of the dorm, which had all the charm of an airport waiting area. And we said, Nick, what is the best thing that's ever happened in this space, as far as you know? And this is not the Dartmouth 7. So, and he looked at us and he was well, that was probably when they brought the therapy dogs in, right? And our hearts shattered in a million tiny pieces at the thought of that this was the best thing that had ever happened in that student's social space. But it was almost inevitable, given how that space was furnished, that it wasn't going to be a cozy space of connection. And so thinking about how social spaces, in existing buildings, we're not talking about building palaces, we're talking about reimagining the actual furniture in student spaces so that it builds spaces where people can come together and relax. Columbia students had pushed very hard to have many of their lounge spaces refurbished as study spaces because of that pressure to always be achieving. And what that does is it means that there's no space for them to come together and lounge around at 4 a.m. We need fewer study carrels and more pool tables in dorm lounges. So that kinds of thinking about how you can build in spaces of community. One of the other impacts of our conversation with Scott Wright was to change the policy. There are so many student groups, and student groups are desperate on the Columbia campus for space to hold their meetings. And so the lounge spaces in dorms were booked from 9 in the morning to 9 at night. And so imagine if when you got home, there was a meeting in your living room. And they're no, you can't be here, we're here. Go to your bedroom. So thinking about not just how the spaces, to get the spaces to exist, but then also to make sure that they're accessible, to engineer sociality into students' lives. So there's certainly a clinical role for mental health promotion, but we think that there's also an architectural and urban planning role in terms of building building joy and encounter into students' daily lives.
Really appreciate you talking about joy. I just wanted to affirm that and uplift that, because so much of what's undergirding our conversation here are these enforced public affects I like to talk about, like burnout, apathy, detachment, that are kind of required to be a producing student, especially on a campus like this. And so it's just really pleasing to me to even hear the concept of joy, because one thing I note about your presentation today and your book writ large is this very real centering of stories and storytelling. And beneath that, you seem to suggest that it's through really beginning to listen to one another, value one another, empathy and so forth, towards understanding that we can tap into each other's sexual projects. And so this may be more of a comment. I don't know if you have a suggestion, but it seems as though part of changing structures, spaces, and funding and so forth is also calling forward a type of general being with one another. And I wonder how we might even begin to turn towards that when, as you said, most students don't even know each other's names in the classroom. So how do we even begin to facilitate different modes of being that might not only, recognize joy, but privilege it?
So Jennifer and I right now are working on what we're calling like a space toolkit, which is sexual assault prevention and campus equity. And the idea of the toolkit, and it's like a free thing we're giving out to every campus, so it's not like a thing that we're selling. This isn't like an elaborate way to get $100,000. Is to think about like, what would it look like? And this actually is gonna relate, I think, also to your question about burnout and campus activists. Like, what would it look like to gather together community stakeholders, from people in housing and dining, to the cafeteria, to student affairs, to student activists, to student people who are really inactive on campus because they feel alienated, burned out, or just, they just don't, they're like, I'm just here to take classes and play video games, which is like, live your life. That's great. So what would it mean to convene those people together and ask them to think about redesigning their spaces? And part of this, what we're asking campuses to do in the design of this thing, is to begin with a kind of narrative project of gathering together as diverse a group of stakeholders as you can imagine, and asking them to tell stories, asking them to talk about experiences. I mean, when Jennifer and I wrote this book, like, when we started this project, we actually had not met before the start of this project. We met, we joked that we were like an arranged intellectual marriage. Jennifer asked a really good friend of mine, Alondra Nelson, to do it, and Alondra was like, I'm too busy, talk to Shamus. And
The rest is history.
Yeah, the rest is history. And, what Jennifer and I decided was that, like, we did not want to write a book that was a strictly academic book. We both have long academic careers, and we know what it feels like to produce a bunch of knowledge and then have it go like sit on a shelf somewhere with all the other binders of recommendations that institutions get in the like locked room that is like that everybody's lost the key to, of like reports and recommendations. And so what we really wanted to do was think about what it would mean to write a book that was grounded in a vision of engagement and transformation, not just at the local Columbia level, but to pivot in the national conversation. It was really immodest, right? Like, I'm not a modest person. And it was like a project of kind of ambition, but we knew that in order to do that, it had to be grounded in the ethnographic study. It basically had to be the kind of stories that we tell. And, for those of you who haven't read the book, the opening chapter of the book is, well, the introduction is just like, here's the framework. The opening chapter is like, we describe it at the end of the chapter as like swimming through a river of pain. It's just like story after story after story of assault. And there are sort of three reasons we did that. The first was, you have to understand what you're trying to explain before you generate the explanation, right? You have to show the thing. The second was, we wanted to show like that assault is not one thing, it's many, many different things. And then the third was to like bring people into the sort of testimony that people were giving, and not testimony in a legal evidence based sense, but actually their attempt to sort of, for the first time, one student told us, like, so many students told us this is the first time they told the story. Like Lucy, one student said, I think it was to you, Jennifer, in an interview, like, I want you to tell Bollinger my story. Lee Bollinger is the president of Columbia. And the idea was like, the way to bring people into this conversation is not through more silence, it's not through more shame, but it's actually to try and tell in people's, like in as authentic a voice as we were able to produce. Because what that's gonna generate is, in the way that like novels generate this, empathy and understanding, rather than like fear and silence. And so for us, like part of the project is this project of storytelling, a project of imagining what it would mean to convene people together and have the facilities people talk about, you know, their own experiences with finding people who'd experienced harm and, you know, a wide range of things. And in some ways it sounds like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where people bring their stories together. But in others, what we're trying to envision is like, rather than the deeply oppositional experience that is an adjudication, which is by design oppositional. There is no incentive for anyone who's been accused of harming someone to say, yeah, I harmed them. Like, there's very little incentive for anybody to ever do that. The incentive is to deny, right? And that creates, the American legal system by design is like located in a logic of opposition. And there's the same logic of opposition between activists and the campus administration right now, not on Dartmouth's campus, but like everywhere. And so what we're trying to do with this idea is like, what would it mean to ask everyone to work towards a collective project that maybe is a little bit different, and locating narrative at the center of that, I think, is it's one of the big first steps that we ask for.
And certainly,
Sorry, Miss, I really love that thought, and maybe that's what you were going to echo too. We are coming to the end of our time, so I have time for maybe one more question. I am really thrilled that Still North Books is here with copies of the book, and then once we conclude, Jennifer and Shamus will be available to sign a copy of the book for you, so that when they win the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for, well, let's say peace, that you will have that on your bookshelf. Last questions or thoughts? Misty, Mingwei?
I guess I want to see if anyone else has anything. Well, I did want to just add a little bit of a follow-up. I thought it was very useful that you said mental health infrastructure, and you talked about, just, built at a community level, being seen. You talked about furniture. You talked about therapy dogs. We're just having such a conversation about mental health here, and I wonder if there are any other final things that you can add to thinking about building a mental health infrastructure so people aren't burning out, to loosen the community burden of that you mentioned earlier.
I mean, I want to circle back to what Shamus was saying earlier about the difference between building a diverse community so you can like publish a brochure with people's faces that looks like a Benetton ad, and building a community that is truly inclusive, where everyone can thrive. Some of the students with whom we spoke, getting a summer internship involved like calling Uncle Bob at Goldman Sachs, right? And for some of the students, it involved sending out 300 letters, right? And so like those 300 cover letters, that is a huge stress at a time when you're trying to keep up with your coursework and do everything else. And so there are ways in which dimensions of campus life that you wouldn't think of as about mental health are just the inequities that are built into campus life fall very heavily on less advantaged students. Columbia guarantees housing for all 4 years to students in Columbia College in engineering. Columbia also has a college for non-traditional students, and they're basically out of luck, right? And so the New York housing market is a nightmare. And so I taught those students for the first time last spring, and on top of the pandemic, to experience firsthand the suffering of housing insecurity. I'm like, well, no wonder you feel terrible. You are facing a lot of real challenges, right? And so I think whether it's financial aid or career services or the way the meal plan is structured or the fact that on some campuses, if you have more money, you can have nicer housing. Like, there are all kinds of ways where suffering is actually built into the campus experience. Because those inequalities, it's not just the precarity, and we know this from public health research, it's a combination of the precarity and the disparity, right? So it's both your own insecurity, but then seeing how easy it is for other students. During orientation week, some students walk onto campus, and they're the first person in their family history to walk onto any higher education campus. And some kids walk onto campus and there is their family's name on a building. And they know a ton of other kids from whatever rich person sport they played, right? So they were at lacrosse tournaments together. And no shade on those kids, right? That's super fun for them and it's great. So the student who is the first person in their family to walk onto campus, they look around and they're like, wait, how come other people have friends already? What is wrong with me? And so addressing both the precarity and the disparity has to be part of building communities where all students feel a deep sense of belonging and can succeed and thrive.
Thank you so much. So many people came together to make this go so smoothly and flawlessly. Thank you so much to our tech people. It's so nice to see you again. Thank you to Bevan Dunbar at Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies for handling all the logistics beautifully. And thank you so much to Misty and Mingwei for organizing an excellent discussion. And then please join me in thanking our guests tonight, Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan, for riveting conversation.